It was supposed to be the happiest day of Jack's life. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, and his fiancée, Emily, looked radiant in her wedding dress. A vision of perfection that could have graced the cover of Bridal Bliss Monthly. The sprawling field where they stood was Jack's pride and joy, a 20-acre slice of heaven he had purchased years ago with the dream of building a life away from the chaos of suburban HOA tyranny. Today, that dream was finally coming true. Or so he thought. The ceremony had just begun. Jack stood at the altar, trying not to sweat through his rented tuxedo while Emily walked down the aisle to a string quartet rendition of Here Comes the Bride. Everything was going smoothly until it wasn't. Out of nowhere, a convoy of golf carts appeared on the horizon, their engines sputtering like angry lawnmowers. At first, Jack thought it might be some lost tourists or perhaps an overly enthusiastic neighbor coming to crash the wedding with a bottle of cheap champagne. But as the carts drew closer, he saw them. A battalion of HOA enforcers clad in khaki shorts, polo shirts emblazoned with HOA security, and expressions that could curdle milk. Leading the charge was none other than Karen McAllister, president of the local HOA and self-proclaimed ruler of all things petty. Karen dismounted her golf cart with all the grace of a dictator stepping onto conquered soil. She adjusted her oversized sunglasses and marched toward Jack with a clipboard in one hand and what appeared to be a citation book in the other. Behind her, two burly men who looked like they moonlighted as mall cops flanked her like bodyguards. "Excuse me," Karen bellowed, her voice cutting through the serene sounds of nature like a chainsaw through butter. "This event is in direct violation of HOA regulations." Jack blinked, momentarily stunned. "What are you talking about? This is my land." Karen's lips curled into a smirk that could rival a Disney villain's. "Your land is still within our jurisdiction, and you're hosting an unapproved gathering without submitting Form 27B for community events. Not to mention you've exceeded the noise limit by approximately 12 decibels. Jack stared at her, incredulous. "Form 27B? Noise limit? This is my wedding. And this land isn't even part of your HOA. Karen raised an eyebrow and flipped through her clipboard as if she were about to read him his Miranda rights. "According to our records, this property falls under HOA oversight due to its proximity to Maplewood Estates." Jack sighed deeply, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Maplewood Estates is 2 miles away. I specifically bought this land because it's not under any HOA. Karen ignored him and turned to her goons. "Boys, shut it down." Before Jack could process what was happening, one of the burly men began unplugging the sound system while the other confiscated plates from the buffet table like they were evidence in a crime scene investigation. "Are you kidding me?" Jack shouted, his voice rising in pitch like a kettle about to boil over. Karen didn't flinch. "Rules are rules," she said smugly, "and failure to comply will result in fines starting at $500 per infraction." Jack felt his blood pressure spike to dangerous levels. He glanced at Emily, who was now standing frozen halfway down the aisle, her bouquet trembling in her hands. The guests murmured uneasily, their heads swiveling between Jack and Karen as if watching a live episode of Judge Judy. "Fine," Jack said through gritted teeth. "You want proof? I'll get proof." He stormed off toward his truck parked nearby, muttering curses under his breath that would have made a sailor blush. When he returned moments later, he was holding a thick folder stuffed with legal documents. Deeds, surveys, zoning maps, all meticulously organized because Jack wasn't just any guy. He was that guy who read every line of fine print before signing anything. "Here," he said triumphantly, shoving the folder into Karen's hands. "This is my deed showing that this property is exempt from your stupid HOA." Karen flipped through the papers with exaggerated slowness, clearly unimpressed. After a few seconds, she handed them back with a shrug. "These look fake." "Fake?" Jack's voice cracked like an adolescent boy's. "They're notarized. By an actual lawyer." Karen smirked again, the kind of smirk that made people want to throw pies at her face, and gestured toward one of her lackeys. "Officer Dan," she said sweetly. "Detain him. Detain him." Jack barely had time to react before Officer Dan grabbed his arm and slapped on handcuffs that looked suspiciously like they'd been purchased from Party City. "This is insane," Jack yelled as Officer Dan began leading him toward one of the golf carts. Karen followed close behind, barking orders into her walkie-talkie like she was coordinating an FBI raid instead of crashing someone's wedding. "We'll be issuing citations for unauthorized use of land, noise violations, and, oh, is that alcohol without a permit?" Jack twisted around to glare at her. "It's champagne. For a toast. At my wedding." Karen gasped theatrically. "Open containers. Add that to the list." By now, Emily had snapped out of her shock and rushed forward in full bridezilla mode. Her face was redder than her lipstick as she jabbed a manicured finger at Karen. "You can't do this," Emily screamed. "This is harassment." Karen rolled her eyes dramatically and waved Emily off like she was shooing away an annoying fly. "Ma'am," she said condescendingly, "please calm down before I have you removed as well." That was it, the final straw. As Officer Dan tried to shove him into the golf cart turned paddy wagon, Jack dug his heels into the ground and shouted loud enough for everyone within a 5-mile radius to hear. "You idiots don't even know who you're messing with. I own this county." The words hung in the air like an awkward silence after someone tells an inappropriate joke at Thanksgiving dinner. Even Karen froze mid-smirk. "What did you say?" she asked slowly. "I said," Jack repeated with relish, "I own this county." He turned toward the crowd of bewildered guests and added for dramatic effect, "Literally." And just like that, chaos turned into confusion, and confusion into something far more entertaining than anyone could have anticipated on what was supposed to be just another boring Saturday wedding day. Jack stood there, handcuffed, his tuxedo slightly askew, and his blood pressure nearing levels that could only be described as medically inadvisable. Karen, the HOA president, was basking in the glow of her self-perceived triumph, clipboard in hand and a smug grin plastered across her face. The guests were frozen in a tableau of disbelief, half of them clutching champagne flutes mid-toast, the other half whispering to each other as though they'd accidentally stumbled into a live episode of Cops. HOA edition. Emily, Jack's bride-to-be, was still clutching her bouquet with a grip so tight it looked like she might snap the stems clean off. "Now," Karen began in her best courtroom drama voice, "let's address the facts. This gathering violates multiple HOA regulations. First and foremost, unauthorized use of land for an event. Secondly, noise pollution exceeding acceptable decibel levels. And lastly," she paused for dramatic effect, flipping through her citation book like she was auditioning for Law and Order, "open containers of alcohol without a permit." Jack, still cuffed and simmering with rage, managed to sputter out, "This is MY land. I don't need your permission to host anything here." Karen tilted her head like a condescending owl. "Oh, sweetie," she said with mock sympathy, "that's not how this works. Your property is within our jurisdiction, and you agreed to abide by our rules when you purchased it." "I did not agree," Jack shot back. "I bought this land specifically because it's exempt from HOA oversight." Karen raised an eyebrow and smirked again, the kind of smirk that made people want to throw pies at her face. "Well," she said slowly, savoring every syllable like it was a sip of overpriced Chardonnay, "our records say otherwise." At this point, Officer Dan, the burly HOA enforcer who had cuffed Jack, cleared his throat awkwardly. Ma'am," he muttered to Karen, "maybe we should double-check the paperwork before things escalate?" Karen shot him a glare so icy it could have frozen a margarita on contact. "There's no need," she snapped. "I know these regulations inside and out." Meanwhile, Emily had finally snapped out of her shock and marched up to Karen with all the fury of a bridezilla scorned. Her veil fluttered dramatically in the breeze as she jabbed a finger at Karen's clipboard. "You're ruining my wedding," Emily shouted. "Do you have any idea how much planning went into this? The catering alone cost more than your entire annual HOA budget." Karen didn't even flinch. Instead, she adjusted her sunglasses and replied coolly, "Rules are rules." Emily let out a frustrated growl that sounded vaguely like an enraged puma and turned to Jack. Do something, she demanded. Jack sighed deeply, a sigh that carried the weight of every homeowner who had ever been harassed by an overzealous HOA, and said through gritted teeth, I already did something. I bought this land fair and square, and I've got the paperwork to prove it. Karen rolled her eyes dramatically. Oh, please, she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. You probably printed those documents off the internet. Jack's jaw dropped so fast it was a miracle it didn't dislocate. Printed off the internet. They're notarized. By an actual lawyer. Karen shrugged nonchalantly. Well, she said with faux sweetness, maybe you should have hired a better lawyer. At this point, one of Jack's groomsmen, a guy named Steve who had clearly been waiting for an opportunity to play hero, stepped forward holding his phone. Actually, Steve said loudly enough for everyone to hear, I just Googled it. This property is not under HOA jurisdiction. Karen froze mid-smirk. What did you say? She asked slowly. Steve held up his phone triumphantly like he'd just discovered fire. It says right here on the county zoning map that this land is classified as agricultural private property. It's completely exempt from HOA regulations. Karen snatched the phone out of Steve's hand and stared at the screen as though it had personally insulted her. Her face went through several stages of denial, confusion, disbelief, anger, before settling on indignation. Well, she huffed after a long pause, that doesn't change the fact that this event is disruptive to the community. Jack let out a bitter laugh, the kind of laugh that comes from someone who has reached their limit but knows they're about to win anyway. Disruptive to the community? He echoed incredulously. The nearest neighbor is half a mile away. The only thing we're disrupting is your ego. The guests erupted into laughter, a mixture of nervous chuckles and genuine amusement at Karen's expense. Karen's face turned redder than Emily's bouquet roses as she sputtered incoherently for several seconds before finally managing to say, This isn't over. Oh, Jack replied with a grin that could rival Karen's smirk any day of the week. It absolutely is over. He turned to Officer Dan and added pointedly, Take these cuffs off me before I call my lawyer. Officer Dan hesitated for a moment before reluctantly unlocking the handcuffs. Jack rubbed his wrists dramatically as though he'd just been freed from Alcatraz and turned back to Karen with an expression that could only be described as victorious. Now, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, if you'll excuse us, we have a wedding to finish. Karen opened her mouth as if to protest but was quickly drowned out by cheers from the guests as Jack walked back toward the altar with Emily by his side. As they resumed their positions at the altar, Jack slightly disheveled but grinning ear to ear, he leaned over to Emily and whispered loud enough for Karen to hear, Best wedding gift ever. Proving Karen wrong. Jack barely had time to savor his small victory before Karen, red-faced and fuming, decided to escalate things in a way only an HOA president could. She whipped out her walkie-talkie like she was about to call in reinforcements for a military operation. Code red, she barked into the device, her voice dripping with melodrama. I repeat, code red. Unauthorized event still in progress. Send backup immediately. Backup? Jack's eyebrows shot up so high they nearly disappeared into his hairline. What was she planning? A SWAT team of HOA enforcers armed with clipboards and passive-aggressive memos? Just as Jack was about to laugh off her theatrics, the sound of more sputtering golf carts filled the air. Over the hill came 3 additional vehicles, each packed with HOA officers, wearing matching khaki uniforms and expressions that suggested they took their jobs far too seriously. One of them was holding what looked suspiciously like a decibel meter, while another carried a roll of caution tape as if he were preparing to cordon off the entire wedding. The guests stared in disbelief as the new arrivals parked their carts in a neat row and began marching toward the ceremony like they were storming Normandy Beach. One elderly relative whispered to another, Is this part of the wedding entertainment? Another guest nervously sipped their champagne, clearly unsure whether they should be amused or terrified. Karen strode forward to meet her reinforcements, clipboard raised like a general rallying her troops. Gentlemen, she announced loudly, we have a situation here. Jack groaned audibly. A situation? Karen, it's a wedding, not an underground rave. Karen ignored him and turned to one of her officers, the one holding the decibel meter. "Measure the noise levels," she commanded. "I want hard evidence of this violation." The officer dutifully began fiddling with the device, holding it up toward the speakers where soft classical music was playing. A string quartet version of Canon in D. After a few seconds, he frowned at the screen and said hesitantly, It's only reading 45 decibels. Karen's face twitched slightly but recovered quickly. "That can't be right," she snapped. "Check again." The officer adjusted the meter and tried again, this time pointing it toward the guests who were murmuring amongst themselves. "Still 45, he confirmed sheepishly. Karen glared at him like he'd personally betrayed her. "Well," she huffed, "it's not just about noise. There are other violations here. Parking issues for one." Jack couldn't help but laugh at that. "Parking issues? Karen, we're on 20 acres of land. There's more parking space here than at Disneyland." Karen ignored him and turned to another officer, the one with the caution tape. "Secure the perimeter," she ordered. The man began unrolling the tape and wrapping it around random trees, as if he were preparing for a crime scene investigation. Guests watched in stunned silence as he awkwardly maneuvered between chairs and flower arrangements, creating what could only be described as an avant-garde installation piece. Emily finally snapped. She marched up to Karen with all the fury of someone whose dream wedding was being turned into an HOA circus. Her veil fluttered dramatically as she jabbed a finger at Karen's clipboard. "You're ruining everything," Emily shouted. "Do you have any idea how much this day means to us?" Karen didn't even flinch. Instead, she adjusted her sunglasses and replied coolly, "Rules are rules." Emily let out an exasperated growl that sounded vaguely like an enraged puma and turned back to Jack. "Do something," she demanded. Jack sighed deeply, a sigh that carried the weight of every homeowner who had ever been harassed by an overzealous HOA, and said through gritted teeth, "I already did something. I bought this land fair and square, and I've got the paperwork to prove it." Karen rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh, please," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "You probably printed those documents off the internet." Jack's jaw dropped so fast it was a miracle it didn't dislocate. "Printed off the internet? They're notarized. By an actual lawyer." Karen shrugged nonchalantly. "Well," she said with faux sweetness, "maybe you should have hired a better lawyer." At this point, one of Jack's groomsmen, a guy named Steve who had clearly been waiting for an opportunity to play hero, stepped forward holding his phone. "Actually," Steve said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I just Googled it. This property is not under HOA jurisdiction." Karen froze mid-smirk. "What did you say?" she asked slowly. Steve held up his phone triumphantly like he'd just discovered fire. Karen stood frozen, her clipboard clutched tightly in one hand, as though it were a shield against the reality crashing down around her. The smugness that had been radiating off her like cheap perfume was now replaced with something far more satisfying. Panic. Jack, still standing at the altar with Emily by his side, crossed his arms and allowed himself a small, victorious smirk. "Well, Karen," Jack said, his voice dripping with mock politeness, "it seems your little HOA power trip has hit a bit of a snag. Would you like to apologize now? Or should we wait until the county sheriff shows up to explain jurisdictional boundaries to you?" Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. It was clear that she was scrambling for some kind of comeback, but for once in her life, words failed her. The crowd of wedding guests, sensing the shift in power dynamics, began murmuring among themselves, some even chuckling openly at Karen's predicament. One particularly bold guest, an older man in a Hawaiian shirt holding a plate of hors d'oeuvres, shouted out, "Hey Karen, maybe you should have Googled it before you brought your golf cart army." The crowd erupted into laughter. Karen's face turned a shade of red that could only be described as fire hydrant. She spun around to face her reinforcements, the HOA officers who had been standing awkwardly nearby, clearly regretting their life choices. "Do something," Karen hissed at them. The officer with the decibel meter shuffled his feet uncomfortably. What exactly do you want us to do?" he asked hesitantly. It looks like they're right about the jurisdiction thing. Karen glared at him as though he'd just suggested she resign from the HOA presidency and take up knitting instead. I don't pay you to question me, she snapped. Actually, the officer mumbled under his breath. You don't pay us at all. We're volunteers. This comment earned another round of laughter from the guests. Karen looked like she was on the verge of either exploding or melting into a puddle on the spot. Jack decided it was time to twist the knife just a little further. You know, he said casually, I think this whole situation could have been avoided if you just bothered to check your facts before barging in here like some kind of HOA Napoleon. Karen whipped around to face him, her eyes narrowing dangerously. Don't you dare talk to me about facts, she snarled. I've been running this HOA for 10 years. I know every rule and regulation inside and out. Jack raised an eyebrow. Clearly not, he said dryly. Because if you did, you'd know that this property isn't under your control. And now you've made a complete fool of yourself in front of everyone here. The crowd cheered at this statement, with several guests raising their glasses in a toast to Jack's verbal takedown. Even Emily, who had spent most of the ordeal looking like she wanted to strangle someone with her veil, couldn't help but crack a smile. Karen looked like she might actually combust from sheer rage. She opened her mouth to deliver what was sure to be another tirade. But before she could get a word out, one of the groomsmen, Steve again, stepped forward holding his phone. Hey Jack, Steve called out loudly enough for everyone to hear. Didn't you say earlier that you own this whole county? Jack grinned broadly. Why yes, Steve, he replied in an exaggeratedly cheerful tone. Yes, I did. Karen froze again, her eyes darting back and forth between Jack and Steve as though trying to figure out if this was some kind of elaborate prank. What do you mean you own the county? She asked cautiously. Jack shrugged nonchalantly. Oh, it's pretty simple, he said. A few years ago, I bought up some land that included mineral rights and other assets tied to the county's charter. Long story short, I technically have controlling interest in how this county operates. The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. Even the birds seemed to stop chirping for a moment as everyone processed what Jack had just said. Karen blinked rapidly, clearly struggling to comprehend how her day had taken such a catastrophic turn. That can't be true, she stammered weakly. Oh, it's true, Jack said with a grin that could rival Karen's infamous smirk any day of the week. And if you don't believe me, he gestured toward Steve's phone. Feel free to look it up yourself. Steve held up his phone again and began reading aloud from an official-looking website. As per county records filed on June 15th of last year, ownership of key assets within Maplewood County was transferred to one Jack Reynolds. He paused dramatically before adding with a grin, That's our boy. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause once more as Karen stood there, looking like someone had just told her Christmas was canceled forever. Jack decided it was time for the grand finale. He turned back to Karen with an expression of mock concern. You know, he said thoughtfully, since I technically own this county now, I guess that means I could dissolve your HOA altogether if I wanted to. Karen gasped audibly, clutching her clipboard like it was a life preserver in stormy seas. You wouldn't dare, she exclaimed. Jack tilted his head slightly and gave her a look that said, Oh, really? Wouldn't I? He replied innocently. The crowd went wild at this declaration. People were clapping, cheering, even whistling as though they were watching their favorite underdog sports team win against all odds. Karen looked around desperately for support from her fellow HOA officers, but they were all studiously avoiding eye contact with her. It was clear that they wanted no part in whatever fallout was about to occur. Finally realizing that she had no more cards left to play, Karen let out an exasperated huff and threw down her clipboard in defeat. Without another word, she stomped back toward her golf cart brigade and climbed into the driver's seat with all the grace of a toddler throwing a tantrum. As she sped off into the distance, her loyal minions trailing behind her, Jack turned back to Emily and offered her his arm. Shall we continue? He asked with a grin. Emily laughed and took his arm without hesitation. Absolutely, she said. And so they returned to the altar amidst cheers and applause from their friends and family. a triumphant end to what would undoubtedly go down as one of the most memorable weddings in Maplewood County history. Jack and Emily stood at the altar, finally able to focus on the vows they had spent weeks perfecting. The chaos of Karen's HOA invasion was now just a faint memory, or at least it would be, once Jack stopped grinning like a man who had just won the lottery and Emily stopped muttering under her breath about ruining Karen's career. The guests, still buzzing with excitement from the impromptu HOA drama, settled into their seats, ready to witness the actual wedding they had come for. The officiant cleared his throat, clearly trying to regain some semblance of dignity after spending the last hour watching Jack verbally dismantle Karen's empire. Shall we continue?" he asked hesitantly. "Yes," Emily said firmly, shooting Jack a look that said no more interruptions. Jack nodded obediently, though the mischievous twinkle in his eye suggested he wasn't entirely done savoring his victory. The ceremony resumed, and as Jack recited his vows, he couldn't resist sneaking in one last jab. "Emily," he began solemnly, "I promise to love you, support you, and protect you. Even from rogue HOA presidents who think they own the world." The crowd erupted into laughter, and even Emily couldn't suppress a giggle. "I'll hold you to that," she replied with a grin. When the officiant finally declared them husband and wife, the guests cheered so loudly it was a wonder Karen didn't hear them from wherever she was sulking. Jack and Emily kissed, sealing their union amidst applause and champagne toasts. It was perfect, well, perfect in a chaotic revenge story kind of way. As the reception kicked off, Jack decided it was time to lean into his newfound status as the county's unofficial hero. He grabbed a microphone from the DJ booth and addressed the crowd with all the flair of someone who had just been elected mayor. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began dramatically, "thank you for joining us today. Not just for our wedding, but for what turned out to be an impromptu HOA showdown." The guests laughed and raised their glasses in agreement. "Now," Jack continued, pacing like he was delivering a TED Talk on how to overthrow petty bureaucracies. "I know many of you have had your own run-ins with HOAs. Maybe they fined you for having your trash cans out 5 minutes too long. Maybe they sent you passive-aggressive letters about your lawn not being green enough. Or maybe, just maybe, they tried to crash your wedding like some kind of khaki-clad SWAT team." This earned him another round of laughter and applause. "Well," Jack said, raising his own glass high in the air, "I think it's time we take a stand. No more living in fear of Karen and her clipboard army. No more bending over backward to meet ridiculous regulations. Today marks the beginning of a new era. A Karen-free era." The crowd roared with approval, chanting Karen-free, Karen-free, as though they were rallying for revolution. Emily rolled her eyes affectionately but couldn't help smiling as she watched her husband bask in his moment of glory. "You're enjoying this way too much," she whispered. "Absolutely," Jack replied without hesitation. "This is better than any wedding gift I could have asked for." As the night went on, guests took turns recounting their own HOA horror stories, each one more absurd than the last. One man claimed he'd been fined for having Christmas lights up past January 1st. Another woman said she'd received a warning letter because her garden gnome was deemed too whimsical. By the end of it, everyone agreed that HOAs were less about community improvement and more about giving Karens everywhere an outlet for their control issues. Jack decided it was time for one final act of defiance. He climbed onto a makeshift stage near the dance floor and announced loudly, "Ladies and gentlemen, in honor of today's events, and in celebration of our newfound freedom, I declare this land officially Karen-proof. From now on, this property will host as many weddings, parties, barbecues, and loud music festivals as we want." The crowd erupted into cheers once again as Jack pulled out a sign he had hastily created earlier in the evening. It read, "Welcome to Freedom Acres. No HOAs allowed." He planted it firmly in the ground near the entrance while everyone clapped and took pictures. Meanwhile, somewhere far away, or perhaps just sulking in her living room, Karen was likely plotting her next move, but Jack didn't care. He knew he had won this battle decisively, and there was nothing she could do about it. As the reception wound down and guests began saying their goodbyes, several people approached Jack to thank him personally for standing up to Karen. One elderly woman even hugged him tightly and whispered, "You're my hero." Jack grinned sheepishly but couldn't deny that he felt pretty good about himself. Sure, it wasn't every day you got handcuffed at your own wedding, but if it meant taking down an overzealous HOA president in front of dozens of witnesses, totally worth it. Before leaving for their honeymoon, which Emily insisted would involve zero mentions of HOAs, Jack took one last look at Freedom Acres, the land where he had not only married the love of his life, but also staged an epic takedown that would be talked about for years to come. With a satisfied smile on his face and Emily by his side, Jack climbed into their getaway car, a vintage convertible decorated with streamers and cans, and drove off into the night while guests waved goodbye. And so ends our tale, a story of love, laughter, revenge, and one very angry HOA president named Karen. If you enjoyed this wild ride through wedding chaos and suburban rebellion, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends who've ever dealt with HOA drama. Comment below with your own HOA horror stories. We want to hear them all. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more epic tales like this one. Thanks for watching, and remember, never underestimate what you can accomplish when armed with legal documents and sheer determination.